All right, folks, so it's just about 10 o'clock. You might have more folks coming up with us today to join along with us. But I want to get started here. I want to keep this fairly compact because, of course, it is a very hot day. So definitely be aware of that. Make sure that you have some hydration and that you're ready for everything as we go forward. We're also going to march a lot of times through some of this grassy, oftentimes wet ground. The last week has been a lot of rain in Gettysburg, although the Weather Channel says that we're going through a minor drought, which is very unusual if you're in this area here. So be prepared to have the right footwear, be prepared to get in some sun, make sure you have some bug spray, just be ready, okay? And if you have any concerns whatsoever, I am here all summer, and hopefully future summers from now. I will not be offended if you need to piece away, get in the car, and get some AC. It's totally okay with me. Make sure that you're being safe. We don't want any more casualties here along Spangler's method, right? On July 3rd of 1863, 655 men exited those woods behind you and crossed across this empty meadow over here, intent on giving the Confederate forces at this front a death blow. In a matter of a few minutes, survivors streamed back into those woods, and 278 of those men, or around 43% of the advancing force, lay dead or wounded in that meadow and close to the wood line that we're standing in today. The battle for Spangler's Spring, as that advance has become known, is often seen as a footnote in the larger Battle of Gettysburg. It doesn't have the same aura as fights around Little Round Top or the high water mark. Tactically, it accomplished very little. As Confederates further to the north of us, in front of most of you folks, Confederates in that area would have continued to attack the rocky and wooded slopes of Culp's Hill. But to the men who engaged in this fight, the battle for Spangler's Spring was a desperate struggle, and one that demonstrated bravery very clear to all who thought about it. Additionally, the fight for Spangler's Spring was, in my mind at least, a collection of multiple different fights. Certainly a couple of fights to gain ground and to push the Confederates away, yes, that's true, but also fights that happened late the previous night. Fights that happened to understand orders, and fights to remember what happened on this very ground. The program today is meant to tell you about those fights by focusing particularly on some individuals who fought in it, particularly the Union soldiers from Massachusetts and Indiana who made that charge, many of whom fell in the process. So in order to understand why men fought over here, it's important to realize what was going on in this ground in the first place. And a great place to start is naturally the beginning. So let's rewind back to July 1st of 1863. A story that's probably familiar to a lot of you. Union and Confederate forces met to the west of town and eventually to the north of town. The Confederates brought more men to the field, and so they were able to push back the Federal defenders through the streets of Gettysburg before they eventually settled to the south of town. Rather than leave the Gettysburg area, they wanted to seize the high grounds around it so that they can have a nice defensive position to invite their Confederate foes to attack them. The most important of those rises would have been to the west and north of us, a rise known as Cemetery Hill, which at the time of the battle offered a nice clear view of the battlefield. But even more important than that, Cemetery Hill witnessed 3 different roads going through it and into the town of Gettysburg. The most crucial of those roads is just to the west of us. If you listen very closely, you can hear cars going down the Baltimore Pike. Cemetery Hill is the keystone to the whole Union position, and Baltimore Pike is the vital artery that supplies all of those troops. The place that'll bring in supplies and ammunition and take out wounded Union soldiers, as well as, if the situation goes wrong, the retreating federal forces, where they'll go to safety. So everything depends on holding that hill and that road. And as a result of that, Union forces start to defend the different areas of high ground around those two positions. There's the arriving Union soldiers right there. One rise that's very important because it's close to both of those areas is known as Culp's Hill, which is actually the collection of two different hills. It crests about 4,000 feet to the north, to most of your rights or fronts, but behind you folks as well. It then goes down to the base of Upper Culp's Hill, about 2,500 feet down, before going back up and spanning close to where we stand over there, right? Ending right around where they were standing, right behind most of you folks. On July 2nd, the around 9,700 men of the Union 12th Army Corps are sent and placed on top of that hill, forming largely eastward-facing earthworks to defend against an advancing enemy. Eventually, those works go down to the very edge of Culp's Hill, but then they stop fairly abruptly to the meadow, the open ground that you see behind you. That piece of ground was described in a report as a small meadow of very low ground, which is considered untenable. Well, the reason it's so untenable is that it's clear, right? It's open. And it's also, if you stand in it for long enough, which unfortunately we're probably going to have to do, your feet start to sink in what is largely soft ground. But the Union forces aren't content with ending their position along Lower Culp's Hill. Instead, they want to anchor their position along a natural defensive point, which just a few hundred yards behind you can be found at Rock Creek. So in that wood line over there, you can start to see, well, you can't really see it today, but that's where Rock Creek would be in the distance over there. And so in order to bring men to that side, they have to detach a portion of the 12th Corps to occupy that wood line and give the Union Army virtually two right flanks here in this area. A right that ends at Lower Culp's Hill and a right that ends further down in Rock Creek, near Rock Creek. The people who were set to defend that position were broken up, just like the entire Union line. And they were made up of a brigade of infantrymen, about 1,600 men strong, made up of units from entirely different states. Normally, those men were under the command of this gentleman right here, the 34-year-old general by the name of Thomas Ruger. But here at the Battle of Gettysburg, that native of New York and West Point graduate has a larger responsibility at his hands. For when the 12th Corps troops were originally positioned here on Upper Culp's Hill area and Lower Culp's Hill, the person in charge of the 12th Corps, General Henry Warner Slocum, was given an additional responsibility, the responsibility to command the troops in this entire area. So General George Meade, commander of the Union Army, decided to give him what is known as a wing command. And so in Slocum's stead, those people under him had to rise up in the ranks. So to command his corps, there was the senior division commander, a man by the name of Alpheus Williams. To command Williams's division, we have none other than Thomas Ruger. And to command Ruger's old brigade of 1,600 men, we have a 47-year-old lawyer from the state of Indiana by the name of Colonel Silas Colgrove. Now, I just gave you a lot of information there, okay? And I know it could be a little bit daunting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass around this graphic here that I made, a nice helpful graphic for you, which at the top lists the type of command. On the left-hand side lists what these men were doing before the Battle of Gettysburg, and on the right it lists what they were doing during the Battle of Gettysburg. So feel free to pass that around, look at it, take some pictures, so we don't have to necessarily go through it again, although if you have any additional questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Here at the Battle of Gettysburg, Colonel Colgrove led quite an eclectic group of people. Their brigade was one of only 3 in the Union Army, and I'll let you try to figure out who the other 2 are, to be having regiments from completely different states. 3 of the 5 regiments were part of the war since some of its earliest days, and that included Colgrove's old command of the 27th Indiana. It also included Ruger's old command of the 3rd Wisconsin, and finally finished off with the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, a unit that was known by some post-war scholars as the best and most disciplined regiment in the entire Union Army, at least for volunteers' sake. So very interesting fact there. All 3 of those regiments fought side by side amongst one another in 1862 against General Thomas Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley, also known as Stonewall Jackson. In August 1862, they battled with one another at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, where they lost quite heavily. And a month after that engagement, when they went to the Battle of Antietam, they were supplemented by 2 other units. The 13th New Jersey, so do we have any New Jerseyans here? Oh, yeah. There you go. Sorry about that. Yeah. And the 107th New York. How many New Yorkers in here? That's surprising. Well, yeah, kind of. Peter over there. They're a big state in size, but that's about it. Anyway, sorry to knock these guys. These poor guys. These regiments who fought. Well, anyway, those 2 regiments fought with Colgrove's, Ruger's brigade at the time, at Antietam, as well as the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863. And although those 2 units fought in those battles, they never quite lost the reputation of being the new kids on the block, right? The rookies of the rest of the brigade. It was with that distinction, right? The 2 versus the 3, that the men of Colgrove's brigade were positioned here at the Battle of Gettysburg. There was space for just one more regiment at the lower part of Lower Culp's Hill, and that responsibility fell to the men of the 107th New York. Behind them, some paces either in the woodline or perhaps resting in an open field that you would have been able to see, were the men of the 13th New Jersey. The idea is that the rookies are with those forces who are with the rest of the 12th Corps, and so if help is needed, they can quickly get it on the way. For the 3 veteran regiments, they are faced in the actual woods themselves, positioned to anchor off on Rock Creek. Now, in order to make sure that this empty meadow was well protected, they positioned the troops in a particular way to make sure that everything was covered. So you're from New Jersey, or we don't have a New Yorker, so you're the next best thing. Why don't you come on over here? Well, actually, Peter, I'll use you for New Jersey later on. Peter, why don't you come over here?
Sorry, Peter.
That's all right. All right. So you're going to hold on to this marker right here. Show everybody what unit you are and tell them nice and loud.
107th New York, 319 men.
Yep, you got it. All right. I know we have a guy from Massachusetts, so come up over here. All right. So end that part of the line in order to protect the meadow. The men of the 107th New York face mostly to the southeast. So face just like that, Peter. While you in the 2nd Massachusetts at the northern part of those woods face to the northeast, just like that. So put out your arms like that. So if any enemy attacks from that open field, what's going to happen to them? Crossfire, exactly. They have to run the gauntlet of the enemy's command. And so this is the way that they're set to protect this particular position. Now hold on to those cards, they'll become useful later on. All right?
Can I ask you something?
Well, the 107th is
I've
up
got a
there.
question over
That's,
here.
1st Maryland. Yes.
Is there a danger that they might hit each other, or are they angled in a way that they will?
They're supposed to, in theory, be angled at a way that, you know, was supposed to protect them, although there's always a risk when you run something like that, right? Something that they would have been aware of. So it was in that position that the men of Colgrove's brigade were positioned throughout most of July 2nd. But that all changed around 6 in the evening, where about 5/6 of the 12th Corps, including Colgrove's brigade, were sent to the left side, the southern end of the Union line, where some Confederate forces had successfully pressed the Union line in that area. That left only about 1,400 New Yorkers in the brigade of General George Sears Greene to protect as much of Culp's Hill as possible. And they did that, holding on persistently to Upper Culp's Hill, but in the process, by being outnumbered about 4-1, lost control of Lower Culp's Hill over here. And so eventually the men of the 12th Corps came back here, recognizing that they would soon have to go into battle to seize as much of the position as possible. General Henry Slocum, commanding the men of the wing at that time, once hearing about the Confederate interlopers on the lower hill, gave his men a very simple order, and that was to drive them out at daylight. In other words, to have the reinforced Union line push the Confederate troops away and secure a much better hold along this end of the line. It would be up in part to the men of Colgrove's brigade to try to make that happen. And we're going to learn about some of that fighting as we head just across the street, crossing the Park Road, going to our next stop. But before we do that, any questions? Yes?
It's my understanding that the 12th Corps that had been vacated to the left of the line provided relatively zero assistance, and that some of them even got lost on the way down.
Yeah, so that's partially true. So the guys of Geary's division, so the 2nd Division, who occupy the upper part of the hill, they get lost along the Baltimore Pike. And basically Geary says, you know, Geary he's 6'5", he's a politician at heart, and so he's known to, you know, stretch things a little bit, if you will. So he basically says that where Rock Creek crosses the Baltimore Pike, he positioned his men there, you know, ready for a nice big defense. Basically just a way of saying, we got lost and here's what I'm going to say about it, right? On the other hand, the men of Ruger's division, while 2 of the brigades weren't heavily engaged, one of them actually provided vital assistance around the Trossel House. If you're familiar with the sacrifice of the 9th Massachusetts Battery on the southern end of the field, it's due in part to some of these largely rookie men from a brigade of New Yorkers and Marylanders to actually recapture those guns and to push some of the Confederate advance away. So the 12th Corps did provide some pretty vital assistance, but only a very small portion of it, right? About, you know, 1/5 of the guys who actually went away from the field. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Right wing. You get to the 2nd. Is the right wing really consistent besides 12th Corps?
Well, early in the 2nd, as you might be kind of alluding to, it really consists of the 12th Corps and the 5th Corps. Initially, it's Meade's plan to try to attack from Culp's Hill, but Henry Slocum, as well as his topographical engineer, Gouverneur Warren, Meade's topographical engineer, they report back and they say this ground is untenable to move from. There is a period of time where it's virtually the 12th Corps. Meade never tells Slocum that, but eventually when reinforcements from the 6th Corps come to the field, they also are put under Slocum's command. And that's effectively 2 to 3 brigades, 2 that are actually, you know, kind of figuring somewhat of action in here. And when you go to Upper Culp's Hill, on the left side of Slocum Avenue, you'll see some of those 6th Corps regiments that are part of the right wing. Yeah, one more question. We got, we'll do now.
Oh, so the 2 regiments facing the 107th New York was this way, and what was facing that one?
So the way that was facing north was the 2nd Massachusetts.
2nd Massachusetts and the
All right, well, let's head across the road over there and go to our next stop. All right, everyone good? So I'm passing around a photo right now. There's a kind of a black and white one. That is a photo taken of the wood line in the meadow from about halfway across. There's a fence that wasn't here at the time of the battle, nor is here today. And then the one that's kind of has a yellowish tint was taken basically further to the west, right, looking at this direction over here. So make sure to take a look at that as I'm talking. It'll give you something to look at instead of my, you know, my Irish burning skin. All right. So on the fighting for July 2nd, the Confederates seized most of Lower Culp's Hill, which is the rise that we're standing on today, and that goes up well behind us. What this meant is that the Union troops who arrived back here on the field would need to fight against some of the Confederates if they wanted to go back and seize the position that they had built the previous day. Part of why they wanted it was because if you look behind me and curving up, you can see the remnants of some of the earthworks that in this particular area, the men of the 107th New York had built in the morning and early afternoon of the 2nd. At this particular time, when the 12th Corps troops were coming back and reinforcing Greene's line, it was great darkness at this point of the battlefield. As a result, some confusion reigned over who exactly was in their fronts. And there are some stories that men from Connecticut, New York, and Pennsylvania had gone to the actual Spangler Spring itself, by which we started before, and there shared in cups of water and shared from their same canteen in different moments of fraternization with the enemy amidst the battle around us. I'm here to tell you that those stories are not based on any real concrete evidence. The federal troops who came here did recall seeing Confederates, but they said that they basically saw them and went away, right, not wanting to engage in the enemy. And in fact, most of the attacks that happened here, or most of the fighting that happened here, was furious fire rather than fraternization among the different enemies. And that included the men of Colgrove's brigade, who arrived at this part of the field at about 10 at night. This was before daylight savings time, of course, and so as a result of that, it would have been about what we'd have 11 o'clock today. So that's the kind of darkness that they experienced at this part of the field. The men of Colgrove's brigade went up the Baltimore Pike and started to cross-country march close to where the Park Road meets the Baltimore Pike today. They knew the enemy was in their front, but they didn't know exactly where they were. And so each of the regiments, men from Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Wisconsin, and Indiana, sent out a portion of their men, their skirmish line, to feel if the enemy was along the wood line known as McAllister's Mill, or McAllister's Woods today. They did so very silently as they crept closer and closer to their former works. And as one of the field officers recalled, we crept quietly along. Not a word was spoken, nor an unnecessary noise made. Eventually, they cleared the woods of only a few enemy, capturing some Confederates from North Carolina, all while some Indiana troops witnessed some silhouettes of their enemy run in the distance and splash into the waters of Rock Creek. After securing their position in McAllister's Woods, the men of Colgrove's brigade basically leapfrogged in their front to see just how close they can get to the enemy before they receive some of the furious fire that their comrades had earlier engaged in. The unit chosen to go initially across the field was the about 30-odd men of Company F of the 2nd Massachusetts, who exited that wood line, came across the meadow, and eventually entered around the woods where we're standing. At that time, George Stewart's Confederate Brigade of North Carolinians, Virginians, and Marylanders themselves were going around this area, seeing where it might be safe for them to position their line. And the men of Company F of the 2nd Massachusetts encountered some of them and captured around 23 prisoners, sending them to the rear. That engagement is what I would like to call the first fight for Spangler Spring, the fighting here at night. But that fight didn't end there when the Company F sent the men back to the rear. Instead, officers of Colgrove's brigade wanted more evidence than the 20-odd prisoners that the enemy was strong in their front. And so the fight continued, this time with 30-odd men, all under the command of this gentleman right here. This guy is named Captain Thomas Bailey Fox, a native of Dorchester, Massachusetts, a member of a wealthy family, who in 1860 graduated from Harvard University. It was there that he was known as a gifted scholar, a born orator, and a talented athlete, with also being known as someone who had very strong anti-slavery positions. So much so that he was even considered to be the major of the famed 54th Massachusetts, immortalized in the movie Glory. So just to keep that in mind, that means that if Tom Fox was in Glory, he would be played by Cary Elwes. I'll let you imagine that as you head forward there. Any Princess Bride fans in here? No? There you go. Yeah. We got a couple.
Inconceivable that there aren't more.
Inconceivable that there aren't more. See? That's good. I like that. So Tom Fox eventually brought his men forward, retracing the steps of Company F here along the meadow. And it was at that time that eventually they started to climb up the rise of the hill, even closer than when Company F was before. I should say he led Company K here, not Company F. By the time they reached a nice plateau in the line, probably close to where we're standing, officers whispered to the 30-odd men to halt in their tracks. Because by this point, where some of the cars are in the distance and where some of you may be able to make out a stone wall, they heard and saw some of the Confederate enemy of George Stewart's brigade. Fox then called on 2 men to go forward to get closer to the enemy forces. Now, whether those men were volunteered or were voluntold remains a mystery, but nevertheless, they would still do their duty as was told. When they reached what was estimated to be about 10 feet of that line, of that wall, one of the 2 shouted out, "Boys, what regiment do you belong to?" The reply was, 23rd. 23rd what? 23rd Virginia. Awkward, eerie silence came to this part of the battlefield. Then one of the people from behind the wall cried out, "Why, they are Yanks," and took one of those men into their lines, all while the second men ran back to the rear. He knew that the enemy was at their front, but in order to get more information, Fox called out to the rest of his line to advance closer to the Confederate position. At that time, one of Stuart's rebels called out, "Who comes there?" To which Fox, bluffing, said, "Surrender, come into our lines." They weren't convinced. And what they heard in front of them was the Confederates ringing out saying, "Fire," and that's exactly what they did. But because of the position they were in, most of the shots flew over the heads of the men of Company K, and only 2 of those men were slightly wounded. Fox's men saw for themselves the enemy's position, and the men in the wood line beyond heard where the enemy was. So comfortably they rushed on back. Okay, there you go. And there's Company K going back right now. They'd retraced their steps, headed back into the wood line of McAllister's woods, and it was there that they and the rest of Colgrove's brigade took on some rest. The men cooked some food, got some shut-eye in, and according to one man from Indiana, took some time to take off their shoes. The first time that they had done that in a few days. More than all that, they waited. They waited for the attack that they believed they would soon either have to engage in or receive from their Confederate enemies. We're going to learn about the place where they did that deep waiting as we head to our next stop. So what we're going to do is we're going to cross the street again. I ask that most folks, if possible, stay along the grass line, or if you need to, just the edge of the road. Okay, we want to make sure that folks can still come over here and still drive around. So keep in a very compact position. We're going to head over there, but are there any quick questions before we head forward? Yes?
Were there any regiments in this period that were rookies at the time?
So eventually, on the first kind of July 3rd attacks, there was a unit that's right on top over there. Their monument's designated behind you. That is the 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. And one of the officers of the 2nd Massachusetts accurately called them Maryland Home Guard units, because that's literally what they were. So they attacked kind of on their own right on July 3rd. I'm not going to go super into that, but all of the rest of the troops in this area, especially in Colgrove's brigade, were veterans. All right, well, let's head on forward. So as I said before, right, the men of the Confederate brigade of George Stuart and the rest of the Confederates who attacked here on July 2nd seized a good part of Lower Culp's Hill, something that the men of Colgrove's brigade came to understand when they engaged in their first fights for Spangler's Spring. With the loss of that position, the Union line went from being a nice, somewhat straight eastward-facing line with only a portion being broken away along their right in these woods, to being in the shape of what I would like to call the Big Dipper. Okay, you probably haven't heard that one before. Okay. You hear fish hook all the time, but there ain't any fish in Rock Creek that I'm aware of, but you can see the Big Dipper in the sky sometimes, okay? So what I mean by that is that right at the top of Upper Culp's Hill to the north, there's the handle of the Dipper itself. It then eventually ends at a southward facing area of line known as the Traverse, which eventually goes out to a farm lane before settling at eastward facing lines along the Baltimore Pike. It's there that Federal infantrymen and most importantly artillerymen occupied both positions of the line itself. The Dipper then curved back up and ended with a solitary star here around McAllister's Woods, which you can see right there at that part of the picture. The Big Dipper here for Union forces on Culp's Hill on the morning of July 3rd. With that Dipper position, Union forces were to try to do a couple of different things. The first of which was to continue the very mission that they started out on in the first place, and that was to protect the pike and the hill beyond. And so Ruger, still acting as a division commander, said that he put his men in a position best adapted to prevent the enemy from advancing toward the turnpike. But at the top of that, if you'll recall Slocum's orders that I gave at the end of Tour Stop 1, these men were also supposed to push the Confederate forces away from this position to secure the Union right, to basically make sure that that bowl in the Dipper will converse and go on top of itself for a stronger position. The aim of that, as called for by General Williams commanding the Corps, was to shell the hell out of the enemy, to use his own words, from the Baltimore Pike beyond. So they were supposed to shell the Confederate forces, weaken their line, and prepare it so that the men on Upper Culp's Hill would then go from their earthworks, go down the wooded and rocky slopes of Upper Culp's Hill, and push the Confederates away. At the same time, the men of Ruger's division were supposed to, in Williams's words, hold a threatening position to the right and feel the enemy cautiously with skirmishers. In other words, the men along the southern end of the front were supposed to tie the Confederates down, all while the artillery and men on the upper hill were punching away at those Confederate forces. That was the Union plan. And at 4 a.m., the guns across the Baltimore Pike, 4:30 a.m., the guns across Baltimore Pike opened up to begin that part of the attack. And for most of the time, the men of Colgrove's brigade held in their end of the action by peppering off against the enemy in the distance. At this particular time, the men of the 107th New York, follow me, Peter, were positioned along the base of the bowl of the actual Dipper. They were in charge of protecting the artillery pieces. At that time, the men of the 2nd Massachusetts, come on over here, were positioned along most of the northward facing wood line that you see today. So why don't you turn around and then hold that up so that everyone can see it. All right, that's pretty good. To their left, the men of the 3rd Wisconsin were set to also face to the north, while also curving themselves slightly to the side, and hence why that monument to the 3rd Wisconsin is to the side, so that basically they can fit in the wood line, so go a little bit more like that. Then, to the right of the 2nd Massachusetts, the men of the 13th New Jersey would face largely to the east. So along this side right over here, facing that way. They would have connected up with the 2nd Massachusetts, but a portion of their line would have also been northward facing. So hold that up so everyone can see. Then the 27th Indiana at this time would occupy the right side of the 13th New Jersey, facing to the east and also a little bit to the south. The men in front over here were occupying a position whereby they can hit the Confederates across the meadow to their front. Meanwhile, the 13th New Jersey and 27th Indiana were firing at the enemy across Rock Creek, made up mostly of Virginians, but also some forces of North Carolinians. Exactly. Whoa! We were having a battle over here, another fight for Spangler Spring. So basically, with these men in line, including Peter way over there on the Baltimore Pike, they were doing exactly what they were ordered to do at the first part of the morning. You guys can collapse right now, but just know where you're at.
Before we leave, is this the dipper right here?
So this is the end of the dipper right here. So this
Okay.
is the solitary star within the whole Union line. Although it itself takes on a nice curved position as you go forward. Yeah, he's asking, is this the dipper? This is just a part of the dipper. At that particular point, however, the best laid plans started to go awry for the Union forces, because the Confederates, who were starting to receive some of that shell and shot fire at 4 a.m. in the morning, decided that they would rather not be sitting ducks for an incoming Union attack. And so they decided to resume their advance and continue to attack up the rocky and wooded slopes of the Culp's Hills. Because of this change of plans, Union Army commanders decided that they themselves wanted to shift plans in order to get the upper hand across their Confederate opponents. And so Henry Slocum, not too far from where Peter was along the Baltimore Pike over there on his headquarters at a rise known as Powers Hill, decided that he would want to send a force forward to try to press the left side of the Union line, to try to hit the enemy at an unexpected position. This all did not come without a certain amount of thinking on Slocum's part. Because if you remember what happened on July 2nd, the Union attack along the left side, or the Confederate attack along the left side of the Union line, had forced those along the right side of the line to deploy and help that exposed position. Slocum felt that an attack in this area would force Confederates along the upper hill to pull themselves out and assist in all of that different fighting. And so he jumbled command a little bit and went directly down to the acting division commander, Thomas Ruger, and told him in Ruger's words to try the enemy on the right of the line of breastworks, to the left of the swale, with 2 regiments, and if practicable, force him out. Ruger understood the ground a lot better than Slocum. He knew the strengths to the Confederate position that his line, Colgrove's line, had been firing against for most of the day. And so he asked Slocum's permission that before an attack was made, if he could send out a line of skirmishers to gather information about the enemy's front to be used for a possible attack if it came to that. Slocum gave him permission, and so Ruger passed on these orders through an aide to come to this part of the line and deliver them to Colgrove. Now I want to enter in what I want to call the second fight for Spangler Spring, the fight to understand orders. Understand what the heck these men were supposed to do in the first place. Carrying Ruger's orders that day was a 26-year-old lieutenant by the name of William Snow, a native of Maine who moved to Massachusetts after the war and worked as a fruit vendor, which I think would be a great gig for me if this Park Service stuff doesn't work out. Anyway, Snow rode up from the Baltimore Pike. But when the bullets started to go around him, he dismounted his horse, and according to one witness, literally crawled to this piece of woods so that he can reach Colgrove. Colgrove insisted in his report that Snow directed him, "The general directs that you advance your line immediately," meaning that Colgrove's orders would be to attack rather than gather information first. Many men from Colgrove's original regiment in the 27th Indiana insisted that their commander did everything he could to understand the orders, and that it was the aide's fault by bringing that in here and messing things up. But then there were those who said that it was Colgrove who changed the orders, saying that Colgrove simply passed on what Ruger wanted and that the colonel changed his mind. One member of the 2nd Massachusetts spoke to Snow a decade after the war and conveyed to a colleague that the staff officer directed Colgrove to feel the enemy, meaning again, to gather that vital intelligence. That same Massachusetts man insisted that Snow was one of the most reliable men of a very reliable regiment, the 3rd Wisconsin in this case. In 1904, there was a reunion of the brigade that was under Colgrove here. And at that event, a former officer of the 27th Indiana read a letter which allegedly proved that Snow simply carried the orders and that Colgrove was the one to change them. I haven't been able to locate that letter, unfortunately, only a mention of it in a Boston newspaper, but I think it's pretty significant that usually Colgrove's base of support will go against him in this case. Also at controversy is the time of this very attack. One early letter written 2 weeks after the battle said that the orders went about at 5:30 in the morning. Ruger, in his report written a month after the fighting, insisted it was closer to 10 a.m. Quite a difference. And the men of the 27th Indiana, when they placed a marker to their unit, wrote that it was at 6 a.m. There's a lot more other sources that I don't want to fully get into. But as one man from the Indiana unit said, all written records fail to show that anyone happened to look at his timepiece and was therefore qualified to state precisely what the hour was. Keep that in mind. No matter who warped Ruger's order and what time it happened, ultimately the effects would be severe regardless. 2 regiments would have to charge across that open meadow and hit a well-fortified Confederate position. One witness recalled Colonel Colgrove pacing around his lines, saying, "It cannot be done, it cannot be done," before shotting up his head and saying, "If it can be done, the 2nd Massachusetts and the 27th Indiana can do it." Now, folks, you want to go back into your lines of the brigade position over here. As they get ready, one important thing to remember is that the 2nd and the 27th are 2 veteran units. So you guys switch places over here. You go in the middle, or you go right over here. Colonel Colgrove at work over here, folks. So you're facing, you are over here. Yep, facing that way, and then you're facing. Good enough. All right.
Just a volunteer.
Just a volunteer, folks. Let's give them all a round of applause. Pretty dang good, I'd say. The 2nd Massachusetts and the 27th are 2 veteran units, as I stated before. As I said initially, the 2nd is known as one of the best officered regiments in the entire Union Army. And so Colgrove knew he can relate to them. Also, what was nice and easy is that the enemy was to their front, and so the 2nd Massachusetts only had to march to the front. So feel free to march to the front over there to attack their enemy forces. What was a little bit more difficult was getting the 27th Indiana out. But remember, this is the first time that Colonel Colgrove led more than just these Hoosiers, at least in battle. And so he knew he could trust these men. He could depend on these men, and even if they couldn't seize the position, they would at least give their best effort if it came from the mouth of their colonel. And so he would go through the process of getting them out of this entire position. What that involved was these men turning around. So you'll about face. Perfect. Then, well, you're going to stay right in line, and that'll be controversial. Then you're supposed to wheel around and go forward into the line of works where the 2nd Massachusetts was. You can stay right there. In the process, the men of the 27th had to dodge the rocks and the woods that are all around us. And also, unfortunately for you, sir, you also had to dodge the men of the 13th New Jersey. So it took quite a bit of time to extract the 27th Indiana. But Colgrove was willing to put on that risk in order so that he can have 2 regiments to rely on. All that we have about why he chose these men is hearsay and guessing. There's no specific account of why he chose them, but this is kind of the best guess that we have for now. All right, thank you all. Did a great job. One more round of applause. Sorry about that. And yeah, and the 107th is just protecting some batteries over there. So. All right. While Colonel Colgrove believed that this attack could not be easily done, it would be up to the men of the 2nd and the 27th to try their hardest. We're going to head to our next few stops, where we'll start to retrace the steps that some of those men took to engage in those very attacks, learning about some of the very men who fought here. But before we do that and head on forward, are there any questions that folks have?
The markers back here for
Yeah.
Massachusetts and Indiana.
Yeah.
When would that have been?
All right, so we'll talk more about the monuments later. A lot of these markers, the flank markers that we call them, were put on in the 1890s. I have measured out, okay? So the 2nd Massachusetts has, I believe, 316 men. I've measured out how long a line of 316 men, if you divide that by 2, because it's 2 ranks deep, how long that would be, and I'll tell you, it's not the length that they give you. My estimate is that the left flank of the 2nd behind you is supposed to conform with the right flank of the Indiana guys. Because remember, the Indiana guys aren't originally here. They come here as they try to make their attack, and as we'll learn in a little bit, they also come back to that position after the fight is all said and done. So read these flank markers with a grain of salt, but as you go around and you use the park roads, you'll get somewhat of an idea of just how weird the position is, right? To the question of, is this a dipper in and of itself? It's something like that. But it's trying to hit as many fronts as humanly possible with only about 1,600 men. In this case, about 1,300 men. Yes?
You said that the Confederates were in works, fortified works. Were they works that they made, or were they works that the Union Army made?
We'll talk about that as we head on forward, but really the works in this case are mostly what was there for them. So in some cases it's the stone wall, and more often than not it's the stones in the trees that they're around. But in one particular instance, as we'll talk about in a bit, they literally turned over the works made by Peter over there, the 107th New York, to occupy their position. Yes?
Hey, Dan.
Hey.
Talk about the skirmishing across the creek. I think mainly with 2nd Virginia, I think. How much of an effect did that have on the initial attack?
Well, it did, I think, had a large effect in terms of, why the 13th New Jersey, stayed in place. They have a battle with the skirmishers across the creek for most of the morning. They say that the first skirmish fire goes off at 3:56 a.m., I think, according to one of their references. So this is well before the attack. There's only a portion of the 2nd Virginia over there, but it still is a sizable portion. And I recently found the memorial guides to all of the reunions of the 13th New Jersey. And if you read them, it's crazy the amount of ways they can talk about skirmishing to their front. But it's a desperate battle over there. And so these men are stable in line. And when you go to those accounts, you're looking for more and more details, maybe that final detail that helps explain how this all happened, but they're concerned with the guys in front of them. So it's difficult things. One thing to keep in mind is that Rock Creek in this area was, I don't know exactly, but I think it's like 12 to 15 feet across. And in this area, because of a dam not too far from us, it's about 7 to 8 feet deep. So this is a large barrier in this area that neither force is going to do too much to cross if they can't help it. Does that answer your question? All right, we got time for one more. We'll do you, sir.
So McDougall's brigade is back behind here.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any communication or any use of that brigade at all in this?
Not really. So there's only portions of McDougall's brigade, which is, so he's asking another brigade of Ruger's division. Most of them are either along the Baltimore Pike or in the fields in this area. One thing that Ruger writes about in a letter that he writes John Batchelder, who's kind of like the godfather of memory here at Gettysburg, he writes that in 1869, is that, he sends the orders to send skirmishers forward. And at that time, he goes and he rides along McDougall's line, occupies a nice ridge partway in the field, and basically has them ready to go forward if they received word that an attack was good over here. You know, you look at the way that they talk about orders and that only 2 regiments can fit in this meadow. Maybe in this meadow, but there's a lot more front over here. And Ruger was willing to use it, but after they see the carnage of the attack that happens despite his will, ultimately, you know, they say it's for naught. Good question. All right, well, we're going to head on forward.
You know, because you couldn't do stuff because they needed materials for the work.
Again, folks, if you want room over there, I'm going to kind of stand at the corner over here so that you guys all have a nice wide view. I'm going to grab this. All right. Can everyone see me and hear me? Sorry about that. So somewhere probably near where the Park Road was, or in between that road and the edge of this tree line, occupied the line built by the 2nd Massachusetts. So just like the Federal troops on top of the Culp's Hills built eastward facing works, so too did the men of Colgrove's brigade build fortifications in this area. They weren't great fortifications. One survivor said that they were made of logs, stones, and rubbish. So just shows you just how much fire they're stopping in the midst of that whole attack. Why I wanted to stop here is because where the men of the 2nd Massachusetts were positioned, was where they would have first received the orders to, again, make an attack to their front. Make an attack to what was then a nice, clear, open meadow and a closer tree line to what you see today. The man who received the orders for that attack was this gentleman right here, a 23-year-old by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Reddington Mudge. Mudge was a member of a wealthy merchant family back in Boston. In 1860, he graduated from Harvard. And here's his Harvard yearbook photo here. Pretty cool, huh? It was at that school that, like Fox, he was a gifted scholar, a nice athlete, and described by the alumni publication as nearly the only man in the class who could be sure of a kind word and a friendly deed from every member. He was an active member of the college glee club, a very devout Episcopalian, but at the end of the day, just like maybe so many of us, he was a family man and a mama's boy. And the very first letter he wrote from the front, when he was in a training camp only about 10 miles from his house, he woke up in the middle of the night to talk about how much he missed his mother. And in a letter to his mother, he said, "I do not believe anyone is blessed with such a mother as I have. In fact, I am sure of it." So I'd like to thank all the mothers in the crowd today. I'd also like to state that today, June 21st, is my own mother's birthday. So hello, Mom. She's in her mid-30s, I think. At least that's what we're going to tell you. Yeah. So it's her birthday, so I needed to state that while we were here. Mudge joined the ranks of the 2nd Massachusetts at the beginning of the war in 1861. From there, he rose the ranks to eventually be the commander of the regiment as a major after his commander was wounded at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But then he rose to the lieutenant colonelcy and in command of the forces of the 2nd Massachusetts here at Gettysburg. When the young man received the orders from an aide of Colgrove's, he gave a very famous quote at his reaction to what he was supposed to do. He first asked, "Are you sure that is the order?" "Yes," the aide replied. "Well, it is murder, but it's the order." Now, if you've studied the Battle of Gettysburg, if you're familiar with the story, or if you've just read the title of my program, you're at least somewhat familiar with this quote. But what did Mudge actually think when he said this? What did he think at the times he went into battle and as he had to go through the tempest of warfare? Well, for that, I'd like to turn to an entry from a letter that he wrote after the Battle of Chancellorsville, describing how he felt in his first time commanding a regiment. In it he said, "I was so astonished at my own coolness and courage that I could not help thanking God and praising him for it in a loud voice. I enjoyed it as much as a game or race until we were withdrawn, and from that time until we were safely across the river, I suffered the most terrible anxiety you can imagine." Night and day here for Mudge in battle. And we have some very similar threads between both this passage and the reaction that he had to the fighting here at Gettysburg. At Chancellorsville, he acknowledged something was unusual, that he had to thank God for this coolness and this courage that he had. All while here at the battle, he acknowledged what he had to do as murder. But nonetheless, he still had the determination to do his duty as he felt it. And as a result of that, we know that this man had some adrenaline pumping in him. Right? Scientists have articulated it more, that in the midst of all of this chaos, he was ready to do what he had to do. And so he turned to the men along his line, occupying that low level of earthworks, and he said to them, "Up, men, over the works. Double, quick, forward." The men rushed out of the woods, and to their left, the men of the 3rd Wisconsin shouted out, "See, there goes the 2nd. But when they reached the edge of these trees, and close to the edge of the meadow where we're standing today, they received a furious fire from some Confederates in their front. As one survivor remembered it, before 10 steps were taken, Colonel Mudge and scores more were shot dead. Mudge at the time was waving his sword over his head, trying to continue with the momentum and the adrenaline that many of these men felt as they went forward. When at the time, a singular bullet hit below his neck, entered into some vital arteries, and killed him almost instantly, around the very ground that we're standing on right now. The young officer fell at the very start of his regiment's advance. But as Mudge acknowledged, orders were orders. And so the men of the 2nd Massachusetts, already thinned, went forward and engaged in the rest of their attack. We're going to talk more about that advance as we head to our next stop. But are there any quick questions we have about the start of the attack, about Mudge, before we head forward? Yes?
The artillery fire from Powers Hill, was that still going on, or did they stop that before the attack?
So the artillery on Powers Hill, it kind of comes in waves. So I can't tell you exactly when there is. None of the men in this line described artillery going on. So in my mind, at least, that means that only a portion of, they might have kind of taken a nice lull before they stopped it up again. They started it up again, I should say. But yeah, I have a feeling that if Slocum and Ruger are aware that there's going to be some kind of advance, even if it's just a skirmish force, that they're going to try to halt the artillery in that position. That's a good question. Yeah, and that's just a guess too. But if we don't have any recollections, not long after that, the artillery would have resumed, because it did a lot of times throughout the day. It wasn't a constant.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
No, just a question. Do you have any idea when Mudge was brought back to Massachusetts?
Yes. So pretty soon after. I'll kind of help end the program actually just around this area here by talking about what happens to him afterwards. But he was buried by one of the other officers in the regiment, and then his father came down to look for him. They picked him up and brought him back home. And Mudge is now buried in a kind of a small Episcopal cemetery in a churchyard.
I was just there.
Oh, very nice. Oh, very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
And isn't there a bust of him in that church too?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a bust of him. There's a bronze plaque. Yeah. And then the grave, it's only 4 graves in there. It's his sister Fanny, his mother, his father, and then him. Yeah. And you have to go into the church in order to get into the courtyard.
Wow.
Well, and I think the Mudge family helped make that church happen. They had a lot of money. So.
Yeah, the church was made in his name.
M-U-D-G-E?
You got it. Yep. Mudge. Read it right on there.
Oh, yeah.
Well, very nice. We'll have to talk more about that. I'd love to get up there one day.
Yeah, that's a good story. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, we're going to head on to our next stop. Again, I would say if you're still over there, continue to go on that side of the road. we're going to stop for a little bit in the sun about halfway across for a short stop to learn about the advance over here. Okay? All right. So just to keep something in mind, as we advance along a similar area as the 2nd Massachusetts, we're naturally slowing down the attack quite dramatically. The men were ordered to go forward at the double quick by Colonel Mudge, which usually means that they would, with the rifles in their arms, jog across the lines all the way to the position that they were ordered to go at. However, when they started to receive some of the enemy fire, naturally human instinct and that adrenaline kicked in to the point where they literally were rushing very quickly. And as one man said, we went across the meadow and as straight and as quickly as we could go. At each step, more and more men of the 2nd Massachusetts fell by the wayside. The very first fire likely being a volley of the enemy, but from then on, the enemy likely fired at will. All right, that's from the evidence that we have existing. One officer from the rear said how he remembered noticing how our ranks were thinned as we advanced with every step we took. Another witness who came from the tree line along the Wisconsin position said that once they reached the center of the meadow, in another instant, the 2nd Mass was being cut down in our front like grass before a prairie fire. But as these men fell, and as they inched closer across the meadow, they were soon joined by a small portion of men who had been in this front earlier in the day. All of those men, about 30 odd or so, belonged to Company E of the 2nd Massachusetts, under the command of this gentleman right here, Captain Thomas Robeson. Robeson was a 22-year-old who grew up in a wealthy family also in Massachusetts. And if you notice a trend here, he also graduated from Harvard, this time in the year 1861. The same alumni publication that talked about Mudge honestly described Robeson by saying, he did not rank high as a scholar, but he was in all things manly, generous, and honorable. And those 3 latter qualities came out here when his men were set in advance of the 2nd Massachusetts early on July 3rd. Because his men were in a very exposed and close position to the enemy, naturally a lot of men fell wounded and in some cases dying from that early fire well before the advance. One such soldier who was shot in his foot called out in great pain, asking if someone might have the mercy to take him back to the rear, to take them back to those low earthworks. And folks, if you want to come over here, let these, come on. Take them back into the earthworks where they might receive a little bit of protection. Rather than delegate the responsibility, Captain Robeson personally took the men in his arms and he carried them back to the rear so that his men might receive the help he so desired. Not long after that encounter, the rest of the 2nd Massachusetts came from those woods, and as they reached an area of ground described as the declivity in the meadow, where it starts to loop down, which you can see around us right now, they joined up with the ranks of Company E and Thomas Robeson. But when the young captain stood up, he received a severe wound in his right side, and soon one enlisted man gave him the same help that he earlier gave one of his other men by dragging him to the rear once again into those woods. That was to be Robeson's death wound, as he died on July 6th in a field hospital here around Gettysburg. His last recorded words were given to one of his surgeons. "Well, I suppose I must go. It is hard for me to die, but with so many bright prospects before me, I feel the cause has been just, and I have tried to know and do my duty." Not long after that, of course, he passed away. Robeson was one of an untold number of men who fell close to the center of Spangler's meadow. Men who fell like grass in a prairie fire. But still the men went forward, just as we will, to our next stop, where they finally started to fire against the enemy that had been dealing them so much damage at this point in the day. So we're going to head on forward. We could maybe, if you have questions, we could answer them under the shade. We want to make sure that everyone gets a nice breath, so we ourselves don't fall in the same position that Robeson did. You all good over there? All right. What's that?
Your voice carries very well.
Well, thank you very much. I like that a lot, yeah. You don't want to see me doing cartwheels over here. All right. All right. So now that we get to enjoy some of the trees in this area, I want to re-emphasize a point that I made before. And that's that this entire area around here would have been more thickly covered with trees, right? Something that you would have been able to see in one of the photographs that I showed you, that taken halfway across the meadow. So that line would have basically extended out close to where the furthest trees are today. It would have gone past where the parking lot and park roads are today. There would have been trees over there. And then the entire Spangler Spring area itself would have had trees all around it. And so it was in this position that the long line of the 2nd Massachusetts advanced to, from the open ground into this very chaotic environment. Not only were there trees, but also rocks, which today and other days offers kind of a nice place to rest, but at the time of the battle offered a good position for enemies to position themselves behind. And the chaplain of the 2nd Massachusetts wrote that the veterans seemed as if every tree and every rock in this area, again, there would have been a lot more of those trees here, were occupied by a Confederate soldier, which is probably stretching things a little bit, but it gives you an idea of what the enemy was positioned like. So the question before about are these earthworks that the Confederates built, not really, but it's the works, quote unquote, that they were able to get behind in this action. They also occupied that stone wall, reaching the crest of the hill, which we saw at our 2nd stop. And also at our 2nd stop, according to one survivor, on the right they were also well protected, having reversed our breastworks. In this case, the southeastward facing line of the 107th New York, with Peter over there. So these men had enemies all around them. And so when they entered in the wood lines, naturally the men started to scatter about, and their lines were not so much heavy, nice, strong formations as much as scattered elements of the commands. A few yards behind them, right, the very competent officers of the Massachusetts unit did their best to dress the ranks, to have some kind of compact formation to threaten the enemy. But ultimately the combat that happened around here was very close, personal, and in some cases even individual. The man who took command of the regiment after Mudge fell was a gentleman named Charles Morris, another Charles here with Charles M. And he said that this was the closest fighting he had ever witnessed infantry engaged at. He said that in some cases the fighting was rifle length apart, as these Massachusetts men scattered around the rocks and the trees to clear out the enemy forces. These men inched closer and closer, starting to climb up the slope of Lower Culp's Hill until probably they reached likely the location where we stopped earlier in the program, although it's hard to say for absolute certain. Eventually, however, the fire became too much. The Confederates never seemed to end, and the ranks of the 2nd Massachusetts were only so large. And so Morris at that time went from the left side of the unit to the far right, telling the men at each step that it was time for them, once he gave the order, to retreat away from this wood line. Once the men received the word, they were ordered to about face, or turn around and march behind. Some of their men recalled how it seemed as if the enemy along their initial right-hand side had come around them and gone behind them. Those might have come from the works of the 107th, or more likely, they were a more sizable group of Virginians, who we'll talk about later, who made a charge across that open meadow. No matter who they were, the men of the 2nd were ready to leave from them. And so they went out of these woods and into the tree line. A witness at the time said that it looked as if the line of those Bay State men were marching on parade, meaning that they are so disciplined here that their line is holding despite all of the bullets and the Confederate enemies streaming around them. Helping to reform the ranks of the 2nd was the same man who I introduced before at our 2nd stop. Right, that 24-year-old Harvard graduate named Captain Thomas Fox. While he was at the edge of the meadow, he eventually received another wound, this time to his left ankle, causing him to limp away from the battlefield. The wound was said to be serious, but not necessarily a death wound. And so he was able to go back home to Massachusetts to recover and be around friends and family. But late in July, the wound took a turn for the worse. And on the 25th of that month, about 3 weeks after his action here, Thomas Fox died among his family and his friends. But while Fox, still alive, hobbled away from the battlefield, the rest of the 2nd Massachusetts decided not to go directly from where they started, but instead further to their right, further to the west, where they occupied what was described as a low detached piece of stone wall which lay in a line nearly parallel to the line we advanced from in the morning, but considerably to the left of it. We don't know exactly where that wall is today. There is a wall that streams out from the wood line and goes well close to the Baltimore Pike. But contemporary descriptions by the Massachusetts men said that the wall was detached, that it was ruined, that likely after the aftermath of fighting here, it could have been taken away before people serving the battlefield could have come forward towards it. And so it's either farther to the west, along parallel to that wood line, or it's somewhere in the middle of what would have been this empty meadow over here. You take your pick. But regardless of where they were, this was the position that the Massachusetts men fought behind as the enemy started to reoccupy the woods that they earlier cleared out. Soon enough, those Massachusetts men reached into their cartridge boxes and found the last rounds that they had that day. And loading it into their rifles, Major Morris decided to try to have someone go over to the wood line and seek what he described as ammunition and orders. The man who volunteered for that action was a private by the name of Amos Madden, who got up from his ranks and literally ran across the open meadow to where his brigade commander was, passing, as Morris recalled, safely through the rain of bullets, one of which struck his canteen, passing through one side of it. Eventually, Madden was able to get orders from Colgrove that the 2nd was allowed to retreat back into the position that they started the day. And so, he passed those orders along. Morris called out to the rest of his line to stand up and do just that, which they once again did with great discipline, as if they were on parade ground. The men of the 2nd Massachusetts, during their attack, which lasted around 10 minutes here in this wood line and an untold amount of time behind that stone wall, placed them in exposed positions throughout the day. But they were lucky when compared to the other regiment who was set to go forward, the men of the 27th Indiana, the men who were supposed to go across the completely open meadow to attack the Confederate position. At our next couple stops, we're going to talk about the advance of those Hoosier men, and in doing so, put ourselves in an exposed position of our own, right, this time to the sun's rays. So just make sure you're being very careful. It's getting pretty hot out there. I'll try to keep things relatively short in the actual meadow itself, but be aware as we head forward, okay? Are there any questions that folks have about this stop or the last stop? Okay, nice and easy. Everyone's mentally preparing for the nice sun. All right, so for the next couple of stops and the nice, sunlight over here as we start to bronze ourselves with the paint. We're going to talk about what I want to call the third fight for Spangler Spring, or the fourth fight for Spangler Spring. The third fight being the charge of the 2nd Massachusetts, and this one being the charge of the 27th Indiana. The 3 that we just got done with, 4 that we're about to start. The reason that I separate those two different attacks is because the circumstances for which each unit had to fight against were very different depending on what unit you had. For the men of the 2nd, yes indeed they had to charge across an open swale, but eventually they made their way into a wood line. For the men of the 27th, it was a little bit different, starting with the very time that they engaged in the attack itself. Now, as I mentioned before with our great volunteers, the 27th Indiana, facing to the east, literally had to turn themselves around and wheel through rocks and trees and push through the men of the 13th New Jersey before they got into their main position. The men of the New Jersey unit were supposed to move, but they didn't do that. They didn't want to go further into close to where they were battling the Virginians across the creek, nor did they want to go behind and further block the men from Indiana. And so they stayed exactly where they were put. And as a result, according to one Hoosier witness, the lines ran plump into each other. So it took some time for the Indianans to move around. It took some time for the officers to separate the two commands, to the point that when they reached the wood line, near the position of where the 2nd Massachusetts had built their earthworks, the line of the 27th was described as being entirely broken. So it took even more time for the officers to make some semblance of unity before they went forward. But eventually they were successful. And with the ringing voice of the Lieutenant Colonel of the 27th Indiana, they cried out, "27th charge! Charge those works in your front." As soon as they got those orders, the Hoosiers rang out with a yell. They were pumping through the same adrenaline that likely inspired the Bay Staters who went before. And one man articulated that very feeling by saying, "We were invincible. We must not and could not fail. A supreme concerted dash, which we were capable of making, would land us inside the enemy's entrenchments." In other words, their momentum would be able to push the Confederates out from the eastern end of the meadow. And so these men went forward. And when they reached the edge of the trees, they began to see some of the dead and wounded of the 2nd. They also saw in that heavier wood line the plumes of smoke and heard the shots, suggesting that their comrades were engaged in battle. Rather than charge directly in their front to help out the 2nd, the men of the 27th naturally turned slightly to the right, meaning that they marched diagonally into this open field around which we're standing. For a long time, those men had it fairly easy. Only a few men hit in the process, but the ranks of the line quickly dressed and people starting to go more and more into each other. However, by the time that they reached that declivity in ground, close to where the highest growth is today, they received their first fire, and one that they wouldn't easily forget. In front of them, close to where that tree line is, was a stone wall, behind which men from Virginia in William Smith's Confederate Brigade occupied. And across the creek, which you could see at a distant tree line further to the right, you had also some skirmishers ready to attack this advancing Hoosier position. By the time they reached that declivity, the men of the 27th received this crossfire from their front as well as from their right. And the major of the 27th, who rode on horseback a few yards to the rear, described what he saw as follows. The first fire seemed to knock the 3 right companies down, meaning that about 30% of the men along the right side, hitting with this crossfire, almost went into the ground as soon as they received it. The Hoosier ranks reeled, but soon they regained their composure, and started to march more forward, probably to around where this monument is today, again, facing diagonally. It was there that they received a second devastating volley, felling many more men in their ranks. By this time, the Hoosiers were receiving fire from multiple ends and basically acting like sitting ducks as they received all of it. They decided that they wanted to change all of that, and with the loaded weapons in their hand, started to fire against the enemy, but giving up the idea of that supreme concerted dash to now being one to fight simply to survive and defend their line as it headed forward. The men would fire their rifles and, as they marched forward, reload their guns before firing their rifles again. The charge of the 27th Indiana, as a result, started to slow down dramatically. But still, those men continued to press forward. And in that spirit, we're going to press forward to the place that they told us was their furthest advanced position, right? Just a little bit away. But before we do that, are there any quick questions that folks have? All right.
Hey, Dave, where's the right flank of their attack?
So he asked where the right flank was. So that marker right there, it faces kind of this way right over here. In theory, that is supposed to be the center of the regiment. So figure about 75 yards to the right, 75 yards to the left. That is the kind of advanced position of it. That's what I guess, that's what I've measured out with, about 75 yards. Yeah. All right, let's head on to our next step. So as the men of the 27th advanced forward, many of them looked for a symbol, right? Something that would drive them forward despite the great odds against them, right? Despite the amount of fire that they received about halfway across the meadow from those two different volleys. And if you're a student of the Civil War, you probably guessed that the symbol that they went after was the regimental flag, right? In this case, it would have been the national colors as shown on Bob's hat over there. See, I think we all know what the Stars and Stripes looks like. I sure hope so. But because the flag was a symbol for those individuals advancing, it also became a target for the enemy troops. In total, there were around 9 men who were supposed to protect the flag as they went into battle. In the first 2 volleys, 8 of those men fell, killed or wounded in this action. The last man to stand that day was this gentleman right over here, Sergeant John Files, a 29-year-old who worked as a wagon maker in southern Indiana. Right, a job just like the automakers of today that requires people to be sturdy and dependable, just so that the wheels don't fly off for the customers as they go forward. Files was just that, as he held on to the flag of the 27th Indiana. And after the men fell to his left and to his right, he continued to surge forward as the men around him began to fire their rifles. He stepped in advance of the men and flew the flag in the face of the enemy across the meadow itself, all while inspiring those behind him. As you can imagine, Files became a target just like the rest of his comrades were. And so he fell wounded, probably just a few feet or a few yards away from where this monument stands today. This marker that's supposed to designate the furthest advance of the 27th Indiana. Files was wounded severely in the lower chest, but he lived until 1912. However, his wound here took him out of the action, and it sent the flag that he was holding careening directly to the ground. Soon 3 more soldiers took up the flag to try to defend it and have a symbol for men to follow before they too fell in the action. 4 color bearers in the span of only a couple minutes, victim to the Confederate fire. Seeing the flag on the ground was a man who was only about a week away from his 23rd birthday by the name of Adjutant William Doherty. Doherty worked as a clerk before the war, and his rank of adjutant basically meant that he was the paperwork person, the administrative official of his command. Seeing the flag, Doherty personally picked it up and flaunted it in the face of the enemy, according to one source. He then planted the flag in this very soft ground that we stand on today to make sure that his men filed in line across from it. Right at this time, to Bob's question before, much thinner, much more compact than it was initially. But around that flag, the men of the 27th stood for only a few minutes, as they recognized that the situation was becoming quite desperate. As one survivor remembered, to go forward was certain destruction, to stay there was annihilation. It was none other than Doherty who first suggested that the men not go forward and not stay there, but instead retreat to the place that they positioned themselves earlier in the day. And that's exactly what the men of the 27th did. As they headed across the line, the men of the unit started to stream to the rear, some firing at the enemy as they went back, others likely running as fast as they could before they themselves start to be like that grass on the prairie fire. Eventually, they reached the edge of McAllister's woods, occupying the line of works earlier built by the 2nd Massachusetts. But it took them some time to go in the ranks, time enough for the Confederates across the meadow to have another idea of what they would do. On top of the stone wall in that distance rose the commander of that Virginia brigade, a 65-year-old man who was then the governor-elect of Virginia by the name of William, nicknamed Extra Billy, Smith. Smith called on his Virginians to press their advantage, to use the momentum to surge forward and to completely press out the Union forces at this end of their Big Dipper. And so men from the 49th Virginia went forward, but soon realized what the 2nd Mass and the 27th Indiana earlier did. And that was a charge across an open position against a well-fortified enemy was not a very good idea. Those men received fire from the wood line. They also received fire from different sides, from the 2nd Massachusetts, whose the attack over here may have convinced them to turn around, but not before they fired into the enemy. Eventually, in a matter of just minutes, just longer than it took me to describe that counterattack of the Confederates, those Virginians streamed back to the rear, their starting point, trampling, as one Hoosier remembered, their dead and dying underfoot. With the collapse of the Confederate counterattack came an end of fighting around this part of the battlefield, at least for a while. The situation largely remained the same, and the nature of fighting was what happened about 30 to 25 minutes before. Men firing at each other from long distances from their respective woodlines. But of course, the situation was not exactly the same, because laying on this meadow were hundreds of Union and even Confederate soldiers who engage in these different attacks around Spangler Spring. At our next stop, which we're going to go back and kind of settle close to where we were before, close to the regimental monuments, we're going to learn about the aftermath of the fighting here at Spangler Spring, while also talking about the 5th and final fight for this area, and that was the fight to remember what happened here. But before we head to that stop, are there any quick questions before we finally get back to the shade?
How old was Billy Smith?
He was 65. So he's the oldest general here at the Battle of Gettysburg.
Oh, he's older than George Green?
He is. He's about 3 years older than George Green. So George Green, the man who, with 1,400 New Yorkers, defended Upper Culp's Hill over there, is the 2nd oldest general on the field, the oldest Union general. So it's interesting that the 2 old guys are here around Culp's Hill area.
Hey, be careful about saying old.
I know, old for the time. You know, all of you are in your mid-30s, right? You know, you're all a young crowd. All right, we're gonna head on forward. Yes.
Is there any idea of like what time of day this kind of finished and how long these couple attacks happened?
So they say that the 2nd Massachusetts made their attack in total about 15 minutes, 10 minutes in the woods. The 27th Indiana, by a similar estimate, was no more than 6 minutes, and it was sandwiched in between the attack of the 2nd Mass. It's probably only 3 or 4 minutes that the Virginians made their counterattack. So this is minutes, right? We're spending a lot of time here, but this is really down to the minute. All right. So as I addressed to one of the visitors before who asked a great question, how long did this take? All of this is just a matter of minutes. And ultimately, the push from the Union forces accomplished very little in convincing the Confederates to do anything except continue what they had been doing before. The Confederate attack eventually ended at around 11 in the morning as they streamed down the wooded and rocky slopes of Upper and Lower Culp's Hill, past Rock Creek further to the east, and eventually concluding their push in this area. There are some scholars who in years later have said that the push of the 27th and 2nd was one that had convinced the Confederates to, in part, go back. But there's not really any evidence to that conclusion. If you read the reports of the gray-clad men who fought here, what they say is that their decision to withdraw was more about attrition against fighting the persistent enemy on top of the hill rather than an unexpected attack along this part of the area. This is something that some of the veterans of that assault made very clear in their own recollections. And as one said, the waste of valor and life was utterly disproportionate to the effect upon the morning's battle. As you can imagine, there was a big waste of valor and life here. The men of the 2nd Massachusetts in their earlier assault and their longer assault lost 139 men, killed, wounded, and captured, about 44% of the force they took in. The 27th Indiana, if you follow some modern estimates, lost the same exact amount of men, 139, or about 41% of the force who made the charge across this swale. Before the Confederates withdrew, but after the attacks themselves, you would have been able to witness the carnage and the stories and the effects of those wounded from a very awkward period where there was a no man's land that existed in this meadow here. As men were firing across the meadow at each other. The historian of the 27th remembered how they could hear the men groaning. They could see the men wounded and dead. They could even smell some of the dying soldiers around this area. As that veteran recalled, their outcries from pain and thirst and their direct appeals for help were irresistible. In different instances, they called the names of those who they hoped might take pity on them, sometimes calling one after another of the names on the roll of their companies. We had a visitor here who knows, where's he at? Yeah, a visitor here who knows someone whose ancestor was one of the individuals who came in no man's land to try to drag one of their comrades before they themselves were wounded in that action. One of the wounded men in this meadow was young Charles Mudge, right, the commander who was wounded just around where we were standing. And again, some of the soldiers who had been under Mudge found it irresistible to try to take him back into line. The person credited for that was none other than Private Amos Madden, right, the same person who, like the Matrix, dodged the bullets of Confederates to get orders from Colgrove. And he probably did so when he was on one of those commutes, either before or after he got the orders from Colgrove himself. Eventually, Mudge was taken up, and he was buried along this battlefield by one of the other officers of the 2nd Massachusetts, who carved his name in a simple wood board so that, per the question I had before, his father can come back here and find him. The mama's boy from Massachusetts was dead and buried, and those who knew him recognized the effects that it would take on those who loved him. In South Carolina, a classmate of his from Harvard, who also was a former officer here of the 2nd Massachusetts, recorded in a letter his reaction to Mudge's death. "Poor Mudge," the officer wrote, "it will be a terrible blow to his family." Just a week later, the author of the letter, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, was killed in an attack at Fort Wagner, leading the all-black unit of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. The 2nd's adjutant, so again, another paperwork man, was named John A. Fox. And Fox lost a brother here when he had fought against the Confederates, and his brother Tom Fox being wounded in all of this action. But despite the loss of his own kin and someone that he was so close to, he took the time to write Mudge's family to give them some consolation. As he wrote, "My brother and Charlie were classmates, and I hold it the sacred duty of my life to fight for the flag they died for, and to see that the causes for which they suffered is in the end triumphant over all its enemies." The 4 fights for Spangler Spring that I described today may not have accomplished much tactically, but they did give men like Fox and other survivors of the action a symbol of unprecedented bravery around the entire battlefield, something that they wanted to properly commemorate. In May of 1879, the officers of the 2nd Massachusetts met together in a reunion at Boston. And it was there that they decided to erect a simple memorial tablet to show where their men advanced from in the action. At the time, there were no unit markers across the battlefield except for the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And so that involved some of the officers literally coming here to the field and purchasing 24 square feet around the large boulder that you see behind you. In December of 1879, without much fanfare, despite the wayside that you can see at the other stop, they put that monument down. A monument designed none other by the post-war architect John Fox. One Boston paper reported during the project that it would set an example. It will be followed by their associations, it said, until the field will be full of historic landmarks to tell the story of the battle to coming generations. And boy, how did that prediction come to life, right? About 1,400 monuments and tablets around the battlefield, all starting with the one to the 2nd Massachusetts. And here we are, right? Continuing the legacy were the men of the 27th Indiana, who erected their own monument in 1887 on a boulder that some men said that the wounded took cover after during that awkward no man's land period of time here on the 3rd. But as John Fox said to a comrade, the best monument to the 2nd is to be its literature. In other words, it was the words written about these men that would last a lot longer than the stones that they put up. And as a result of that, veterans were very careful in trying to get all of those words right. In the 1890s, a military history of Massachusetts was put out, which described each of the units that fought in the Civil War. That included the 2nd Massachusetts, and that included their advance across this meadow here in 1863. It described their heroism and their bravery, but in the process, it talked about the 27th Indiana as largely cowardice people, individuals who fell back in disorder during the charge. The report caught the attention of an Indianapolis printer by the name of John Rankin, who at the age of 20 fell wounded severely in his left thigh somewhere in the middle of that meadow. Now in his late 40s, Rankin decided to take up the pen and to write in the pages of the veteran newspaper called the National Tribune to correct what was going wrong. He called the Massachusetts report a piece of cold-blooded, deliberate misrepresentation. He then gave his own interpretations of the battle and stated, "A regiment has no more right to counterfeit glory than a man has a right to counterfeit money." Responding to that action was Captain Julian Hinckley, a man who fought in the 3rd Wisconsin in the wood line in a stationary position as he watched the battle from what he described as a looking glass. Hinckley talked about the sacrifice of both the 27th and the 2nd, but continued to state that the 27th broke well before their Bay State colleagues did. And so what followed was a war of words between both sides. Hinckley accusing Rankin of not being a good team player. Rankin saying that Hinckley and his supporters furnished a lot of words signifying nothing. Both of these men came from a place of justifiable anger. They felt that their assaults here were being attacked, that the 4 fights they fought here at Spangler Spring were for naught, in the words of some of their comrades. But no matter how they reacted to the situation, these men recognized that all of the men from each of the different states shared in some difficult fights throughout the Civil War, including the 4 prior fights for Spangler Spring. This idea is reflected in the very design of the monuments to the 27th and 2nd. Monuments that stand right next to each other. And that was something that the historian of the 27th Indiana remarked upon in words that I'll end my program with today and leave you with as you explore the rest of the battlefield to consider why they put these monuments in the locations that they did. As he said, moderate in size, design, and cost, neither of these monuments appeals to the unthinking and sensuous. But standing there, side by side, day and night, in shine and storm, through heat and cold, as faithful sentinels of the 2 regiments so often stood in old days, they will forever continue to tell, to those who will reflect upon it, a thrilling story of courage, daring, and sacrifice. And so with that, folks, I'd like to thank you all for coming out and braving the heat today as you learned about that story of courage, daring, and sacrifice.